The accepted explanation for the 400,000 figure is, on the surface, quite straightforward. Transit authorities stated that ridership was measured using three primary methods: turnstile data, ticket sales records, and periodic manual surveys conducted at key stations. These were not unusual approaches. In fact, they were considered standard practice across many urban transit systems during that era. The data from these three sources was compiled, averaged, and reported as a reliable daily ridership figure. That is the official account. And at first, it sounds entirely reasonable. But this is where it becomes unclear. When researchers begin looking at the actual turnstile data from the relevant period, a consistent problem appears. The records are not complete. Certain stations have data covering some months of the year, and then nothing for others. These are not small or remote stations. Some of the gaps appear at locations that would have been among the busiest points in the system. A complete ridership count depends on consistent data collection across all stations. When that consistency is missing, the reliability of the final number becomes difficult to confirm. This raises questions about how those gaps were handled, whether they were estimated, excluded, or filled using a method that was never clearly documented. The manual survey records present a similar issue. Administrative files from the period reference these surveys directly. They are mentioned as a supporting source for the ridership figures. But the survey documents themselves, the actual fieldwork, the counting sheets, the compiled results, are not consistently present in the archive. Some exist. Others are referenced but cannot be located. This matters because manual surveys were meant to verify and supplement the mechanical data. Without them, one of the three pillars of the official counting method is only partially visible. It doesn't fully make sense that a process described as thorough would leave so little of its own evidence behind. Then there is the question of ticket sales. Sales records do exist, and they are more consistent than the other sources. But ticket sales measure transactions, not individual people. A commuter purchasing a monthly pass is counted very differently in sales data than a tourist buying a single journey ticket.
When you move beyond the primary official reports and start examining a wider range of documents from the same period, the picture becomes more complicated. Regional transportation studies, independent assessments conducted by planning bodies and urban researchers during that era, also reference this subway system. They mention it, analyze it, and in some cases cite ridership figures directly. But those figures do not consistently match the 400,000 number that appears in the official record. Some studies place daily ridership noticeably lower. Others do not offer a fixed number at all, instead describing ridership as something that shifted considerably depending on the time of year, the economic climate, and the availability of other transit options in the area. That variation alone raises questions. A system with stable, high-volume daily ridership should produce relatively consistent figures across independent sources. The fact that it does not is worth noting. One detail in particular stands out: an internal planning document from that period, not a public-facing report, but an administrative working file, uses the phrase estimated average use when referring to daily ridership. That is a different kind of language than confirmed daily count. Estimates and confirmations are not the same thing. An estimate can be reasonable and well-informed, but it carries a margin of uncertainty that a confirmed figure does not. The fact that this language appears in an internal document, while the public-facing number was presented as precise and verified, introduces a subtle but meaningful gap. It doesn't fully make sense that both descriptions would apply equally to the same data. Then there was the infrastructure question. Transit engineers who have studied systems from this era have pointed out that station design matters enormously when assessing realistic capacity. Platform lengths determine how many passengers can board and exit safely at one time. Entry and exit configurations affect how quickly large crowds can move through a station. For certain stations in the system, the physical design of that period would have made consistently processing very high daily volumes a logistical challenge. This does not confirm that the number is incorrect. Systems find ways to manage. Crowds adapt. But it does raise the question of whether the engineering planning documents from that time reflect an assumption of 400,000 daily riders. Because if they do not, that gap is significant. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. At this point in the investigation, something has shifted. The questions are no longer about one missing file or one number that does not match. What is emerging across the available records is something broader and more consistent. It is a pattern. And patterns, unlike isolated gaps, are harder to set aside with a simple explanation. When the same kind of discrepancy appears once, it can be accidental. When it appears across multiple record types, collected by different people, serving different administrative purposes, the situation becomes more difficult to explain away. The record types involved here are not minor or peripheral. Administrative logs, engineering assessments, financial allocation documents, and independent third-party transit studies. These represent different layers of how a transit system is documented and understood. And across all of them, the same core issue keeps surfacing. The public figure and the internal working assumptions do not consistently align. Budget records from the system's peak operational years reflect spending levels that researchers have described as relatively modest for an operation of the claimed scale. Running a transit system that serves 400,000 riders daily carries significant costs. Fuel, maintenance, staffing, infrastructure upkeep, those costs should be visible in financial records. In some areas they are, but the overall expenditure picture, according to several researchers who have examined these documents, does not fully reflect what that volume of daily operation would typically require. This raises questions that the available records do not clearly answer. The staffing data adds another layer to this. Payroll records, where they have survived, indicate workforce levels that some transit historians consider lower than what would be expected for a system handling that many daily passengers. Station staffing, operational crews, administrative personnel, all of these scale with ridership. A system moving 400,000 people requires a workforce calibrated to that demand. And this is where the explanation starts to weaken, because each of these discrepancies, taken individually, could still be explained. Budget efficiencies are real. Shared resources between departments are possible. Different accounting methods can make it.
Several explanations have been put forward over the years to account for why the records and the number do not consistently align. Researchers, transit historians, and archival investigators have each approached the problem from different directions, and while their conclusions vary, one thing they share in common is this: none of the proposed explanations have been fully ruled out, and none have been fully confirmed. That alone says something about where this investigation currently stands. The first theory centers on what some call administrative rounding. Transit authorities during that era did not always operate with the kind of precise data verification that might be expected today. Projections were sometimes reported alongside confirmed figures, and over time, the distinction between the two could become blurred. A number that began as an optimistic estimate, a reasonable approximation based on available data, could gradually be repeated across enough reports and publications that it began to function as confirmed fact. The 400,000 figure, in this view, may never have been the product of a complete and verified count. It may have been a working estimate that accumulated credibility simply through repetition. But this theory, while plausible, does not fully explain why some internal documents appear to treat the number as confirmed rather than projected. The second theory focuses on record loss. Archives from this period were not maintained with consistency. Administrative reorganizations, institutional transfers, and routine document disposal all took place across the decades that followed. What survives in the archive today may represent only a portion of what was originally recorded. Under this theory, the gaps and inconsistencies are not signs of a problem with the number itself. They are simply the natural result of imperfect preservation. Some researchers find this explanation reasonable. Others are less certain, pointing out that the pattern of what is missing is not entirely random, and that certain categories of supporting documentation are absent in ways that are difficult to attribute to chance alone. A third perspective questions the counting methodology at its foundation. Different reporting periods may have defined a rider differently. A transfer between lines, a return journey, a partially used ticket. How these were counted, or whether they were counted at all, may have shifted over time without that shift being clearly documented. If the definition of a rider changed across different counting periods, then comparing figures across those periods becomes unreliable, and the consistency of the 400,000 number may be more superficial than it appears. This raises questions that the 400,000. That is the number. It appears in reports and articles, in official transit statements, and in historical summaries written decades apart. It is repeated so consistently that it has come to feel like an established fact, something confirmed, verified, and settled long ago. But when you actually try to trace where this number comes from, something unusual begins to happen. The sources cite other sources. Those sources reference earlier documents. And those earlier documents, when you try to locate them, are often incomplete, difficult to access, or simply absent from the public record. This is not the kind of gap you would expect from a figure this specific. A number like 400,000 implies counting. It implies a method, a process, and a result that was recorded somewhere. But the foundation beneath that number is not as solid as the number itself suggests. That is where the first question appears. Consider what a transit system carrying 400,000 riders every single day would actually require. The operational scale alone would be significant. There would be staffing rosters reflecting daily workforce needs. There would be maintenance logs documenting wear on tracks, platforms, and carriages at high volume levels. There would be budget records showing allocations that match the cost of running a system at that capacity. And there would be ridership logs, consistent, cross-referenced, and detailed, that form a paper trail proportional to the claim. Some of these records exist, but the trail is uneven. Certain documents are present, others are not. And among the ones that do survive, the details do not always agree with each other. At first, this seems like a normal feature of old records, but the inconsistency runs deeper than simple archival gaps. What makes this worth examining is not that the records are old. Old records go missing. That is not unusual. What is unusual is the specific pattern of what is missing and what remains. The number 400,000 persists clearly across sources, but the underlying documentation that should support a figure of that